Okay, so let's talk about how the US is also getting involved in covert operations in Latin America. So this shows us again that the threat of communism is by no means just confined to Eastern Europe, to Asia, to Africa. There's also a major threat in Latin America, which really scares the US because that would mean that communism would be reaching the Western Hemisphere. So there is a new president that is elected in Guatemala. His name was Jacobo Arbenz, and he sponsored a very leftist government that was effectively socialist or communist. He tried to initiate a pretty radical policy of land reform, and the problem with that was that the U.S. actually owned a ton of land in Guatemala. They established effectively what we call a banana republic, and that they really developed significant plantations in the banana industry. They profited off of the cheaper land in Guatemala and exported a ton of their product from Guatemala and consumed it in the U.S. And so basically, they don't want to lose all that property in Guatemala with this new land reform that Arbenz sponsors. So basically, we see that that the CIA intervenes and actually sponsors a coup that overthrew Arbenz's government. This is significant because Arbenz is actually replaced by a military dictator. And so that shows us that the U.S. was actually more willing to support a military dictatorship than a democratically elected communist, which is really significant here. So basically what we see is, again, it's sort of this hypocritical undermining of that self-determination that the U.S. was supposed to support, right? Ever since the League of Nations, or ever since Wilson's 14 Points and also the Atlantic Charter. So they're being sort of hypocritical here. We also see other instances where the U.S. is trying to stop the spread of communism in Latin America. We will talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis on the Kennedy videos. But yeah, they try to sponsor the assassination of Castro a whole bunch of times. And what we see is that all these CIA operations actually lead to a lot of anti-American feelings, especially in Latin America and also in Iran. So in Asia, we know that we left off the Korean War started during Truman's administration, but it's still going on when Eisenhower is president. And as we remember, one of Eisenhower's campaign promises was to go into Korea and end the war. So he does keep his promise. And he tries to figure out a way to stop the war, but we do find that there's no quick fix to end the war, partly because there was a growing sense of a threat of nuclear war, and also the death of Stalin sort of leads China and Korea to agree to an armistice and exchange prisoners, and this happens in 1953. The fighting, when it stops, there's going to be a new border drawn between North and South Korea. It's this line here, the demilitarized zone. And so we see that this isn't too far off from the 38th parallel, which is what divided the peninsula before, after Korea's occupation by Japan ended and the the USSR took control of the North and the US took control of the South. So what's significant about this is that this was an armistice. This did not actually end the conflict between North and South Korea. So the idea is that a new war could break out at any time, right? It's important for us, obviously, because we know that that sense of rollback of communism is not successful in the case of the Korean War. North Korea, obviously, if we think about the impact on today, remains increasingly separate from the West, and they are a growing threat in the sense that they have been increasingly developing nuclear technology. So let's think about Vietnam. We are not yet at the Vietnam War era, per se, for the U.S., but what we do see is that when the French lose control over Indochina, the U.S. feels an increasing obligation to intervene in the region. This is similar to the Eisenhower Doctrine in a sense, because we can think about how that sort of void that the decline of the power of countries like Britain and France left behind was filled in by the U.S. because they were so nervous that communism would spread to that region if there was a sort of a vacuum left behind in that region. So France still occupied Indochina after World War II. And what we're going to see is that they lose it to Japan during World War II. Vietnamese and Cambodians tried to resist the French from taking back over Vietnam after the war is over. And what we see is that by 1950, there was a major anti-colonial war going on in Vietnam. So there are guerrilla warriors that are fighting against the French, basically. And what we see happening is that the Soviets actually aid the communist guerrillas that were sponsored by Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Korea. And what happens is that at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French are going to be forced to surrender from Vietnam. So in 1954, the French actually give up their colony in Indochina. Then Indochina is going to be divided into 3 countries: Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. So this is significant because now we see, since the Soviets helped out the North Vietnamese guerrillas, there's going to be essentially a civil war that breaks out in Vietnam after this, which is what eventually leads the U.S. to intervene in Vietnam. So Vietnam is going to be temporarily divided at the 17th parallel, so, similar to Korea. And the idea was to keep them divided until a general election could be held. In the meantime, we have temporary leaders established on both sides of the border. So in the south, Ngo Dien Diem was installed as the leader of South Vietnam, and North Vietnam was controlled by Ho Chi Minh, who established a military dictatorship, or a communist dictatorship, rather. Diem, the leader of the South, cancels the elections. He tries to unite the country under capitalism, and what this does is it results in a full-scale civil war between North and South Vietnam. From 1955 to 1961, before the U.S. actually gets involved militarily, they send over $1 billion of aid to South Vietnam because they want to try to build a stable anti-communist state there. Now, the reason why Eisenhower supported this aid to Vietnam is because of the domino theory that he articulated. And what this meant was that if South Vietnam would fall to communism, then other countries in Southeast Asia would also fall. And, their fear was that it might even spread to places like Australia, and then it would continue to spread and might even reach their own soil. As in an effort to try to prevent communism from spreading to Asia, John Foster Dulles establishes a new treaty. It's called the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SEATO, and this is significant because this is, sort of an Asian version of NATO. So basically, the same thing applies. It was a defensive pact in case there was an attack on the region, and SEATO was signed by the U.S., Great Britain, France, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan. All right, so Eisenhower is going to leave office by 1961. And so if we think about his legacy, first off, even though we don't actually have a Cold War thaw, we at least experienced the potential of one. So we saw with these Spirit of Geneva and the Spirit of Camp David that there was at least some relaxation of tensions with the Soviet Union. It did seem like Khrushchev could have a better relationship with the United States. We also, by 1958, do see the first efforts to limit arms by voluntarily suspending above-ground testing of nuclear weapons. But Eisenhower, when he gave his farewell address, he did warn the country about the new military-industrial complex that was developing. And in other words, basically what this means is that he was scared that the arms race was taking on a momentum all on its own, and he feared that the U.S. was turning into a military state. So the idea was that it was sort of taking away funding from domestic programs, right? So Ike's own doubts about the growing military-industrial complex of the nation certainly reflect a continued sense of anxiety about where the country is going in Cold War tension. And we'll, of course, experience a continuation of the Cold War under Kennedy and also Johnson's presidency, which in some ways really reaches a peak in this antagonism because of Vietnam. So we'll pick up with JFK's administration in the last video of this segment. Thanks for watching.